I would like to welcome Dr. Tim Noakes back to the Grove City College Exercise Science Symposium. It's our honor and privilege to be speaking to you today. Um, for those of you who are not familiar with Dr. Noakes, here's just a quick introduction. He studied at the University of Cape Town and obtained his medical degree in 1981, and he's doctorate of science in medicine, exercise science in 2002. He's one of the co-founders of the Sports Science Institute of South Africa. Professor Noakes has published more than 750 scientific books and articles. He's been cited more than 16,000 times in the scientific literature. He's wrote numerous best-selling books, including The Law of Running, Consider the Bible in Sport, also Challenging Beliefs, Waterlogged, and more recently, The Real Meal Revolution, Raising Superheroes, and then his latest and greatest book, Law of Nutrition, which I just got done reading about a month ago. And if you have not read that book, it's really good, and I would recommend you read it. So, thank you, Dr. Noakes, for speaking.
Yes, thank you. Lovely to be with you again, Philip. Thank you for having me.
So, the topic of this year's Exercise Science Symposium is looking at strategies for recovery and regeneration. So, we're gonna start off there, and then we'll branch off into some other topics, talking about fatigue and factors that drive human performance and nutrition, etc., etc. So first off, as a former, or still as an athlete yourself, you've run quite a few marathons. I think like 70 marathons and ultra marathons. I think you started off rowing, I think.
That's correct.
Yes, and you say you've been involved around sport yourself. Plus, you work with athletes, recreational athletes, competitive athletes, different teams, etc. Also, as a former athlete myself, I know a little bit about this. I played tennis competitively for about 20 years or so, and so we know if you're an athlete, if you're in sport for a good period of time, you get these little nagging injuries the whole time. You have aches, you have pains, you have inflammation, you have maybe increased infections or upper respiratory tract infections, and so so a lot of athletes suffer from that or experience that, and so from your work or from your experience, do you think that is just a matter of, is it overtraining or is it under recovery? I know you've worked with, you had something to do with this also with the South African rugby team. I think in their build-up to the 2007 Rugby
That's
World
correct.
Cup. So, what do you think is that has something to do with they're just training too much, too little rest?
It's really interesting because when I was more serious as an athlete, no one spoke about recovery. It was only about what you could do in training, and now we're kind of slipping the other way and saying recovery is perhaps just as important.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that obviously the great problem for athletes is to overtrain and do too much. That's the elite Olympic athletes. And the other side is people do nothing and think that they can get not training. So I think I get criticized sometimes for saying, oh, but you're warning people not to overtrain. But in fact, the vast majority of people are undertraining. I think once you're doing an hour to 2 hours a day, that's kind of the limits of what most of us can do if we've got a busy daytime job. I remember my great friend who won the Comrades 5 times, Jackie Meckler, you'll remember his name. He said being a professional athlete is getting paid to rest. They would run, and I think if you look at the Kenyans, they just run, but they spend a lot of time resting, and they've got the right mixture. So they can train hard because they're not trying to do everything else at the same time. And so I think that's the first point. We try to put too much into our lives, and then all the stresses combine.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other thing is that the less good athletes tend to overtrain. So the very best don't realize they don't need to train as hard as everyone else, or should I say that their hard training will be enough to win.
Yeah.
To us who are losers, we think, well, if we train a bit harder, I had to win, and it doesn't work out that way, then we get overtrained.
Yeah.
You mentioned the Springbok rugby team that we worked with in 2007, leading up to the World Cup. And there it was very clear that we could monitor how many games they played, and that would predict who was going to get injured. And they could last about 3 years at a very high level, but each of them could play so many minutes in a one season. And once they went to beyond that, they would break down. So they could exceed it for a year or two, but the third year they were in trouble. And it was so consistent that we built that into our programming, and ultimately they were very successful because we got the players fit on the right day. I think the science of exactly how much training you need to do is way advanced compared to what it was.
Yeah.
And I think we now can monitor people much more effectively and decide how much they should train. I remember the lovely story when I was interested in running competitively was Kenny Moore described how at Oregon he was trained, and his coach said to him, his coach Bill Bauman said to him one day, he said, "You've got I think it was a 5,000 meter race or 10,000 meter race coming up in 3 weeks' time. From this day till then, you will not train except where I'm in your company and I can see you training."
Mm-hmm.
And not Jimmy, and Moore was very unhappy about that because he had to train 7 days a week flat out. And he was forced to train less. And anyway, in the race, he did his best time by about 30 seconds. And afterwards, his coach Bauman came up to him and said, "You did well." And then Moore got the message that he'd been overtraining, and he realized that we're all different and we can only do so much training.
Yeah.
So I think that's what I've learned. I've learned that at the very top end, there's a real risk of overtraining, particularly amongst the guys who are coming second and third and fourth, who think that if they train more, they'll be successful. Now, having said all that, I think also what I've learned is the role of nutrition and diet, and these high carbohydrate diets, I think, are a problem that I think make you more inflamed and so on. And
that was my next question. What was,
yeah.
What do you think the whole, how does the dietary aspect filter into that? I mean, whatever your habitual diet looks like, I mean, certain foods is it more pro-inflammatory, and certain foods are more anti-inflammatory. So again, going forward with that topic, how does your habitual diet, right, whatever you're putting into your mouth, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and the snacks in between, how does that influence the whole recovery and regeneration process, you think?
I think it's got a huge effect, because now let's go back to where I misled the world. And, it was all carbohydrates in the book behind you, Law of Running. Yeah. We were teaching people to eat kilograms of carbohydrate a day and stuff themselves immediately they'd finish running. Well, what that does is causes your insulin to spike. And insulin is, in my view, quite a toxic hormone, and all the effects of insulin have to be factored in.
Mm-hmm.
So we thought if you were running enough, you could burn the carbs and it'd be fine. It didn't matter that you ate chips and biscuits and you drank cola drinks and lots of Gatorade, and no one questioned that you're spiking your glucose and insulin all the time. Mm-hmm. We also didn't understand that people who are insulin resistant are more likely to develop Achilles tendon injuries and other tendinitises. Mm-hmm. So there's something there as well, and so I think that's important. I think, of course, you'll know Dave Scott, the Ironman triathlete, wins it 6 times. Mm-hmm. He converted to the high-fat diet about 3 years ago, and he said, I now realize that I will not allow my athletes to train heavily on a high-carbohydrate diet because of the inflammation. They may last 5 or 6 years, but then their performances tend to drop off. And this is a guy who's been coaching athletes for 40 years, mm-hmm. and he's seen the light. Yeah. So I think that there's much more to diet than we've ever considered. And the idea that you must just keep your glycogen high, that is simplistic. You must keep your insulin low as well, mm-hmm. in order to prevent inflammation.
Yeah. Now, what about from that training standpoint? You hear this concept of maybe train low, compete high. Right? So train on a low carbohydrate, based diet, but maybe when competition comes up, then you introduce a little bit more carbohydrate. Is that more acceptable, or?
Yeah, I think definitely. I think that's the way most athletes are going. And certainly in the high intensity, short duration activities, let's say up to 5Ks or 10Ks, up to half an hour, or perhaps an hour, maybe even up to 2 hours. I think it's clear those athletes are still at the top level, continuing to eat lots of carbohydrate. But increasingly at distances beyond that, the carbohydrate consumption is dropping dramatically, and the amount of carbs they eat habitually is also dropping. Yeah. And they're realizing that you can burn fat at enormously high rates if you're fat adapted.
Yeah.
So I think that that's a big change. And it's interesting because when I started on a high-fat diet, I wasn't going to allow anyone to eat anything but fat. But I've moderated. And I do agree that there are some athletes in high-intensity exercise, they do need a bit more carbohydrate. But nowhere near as much as I was writing in Law Running, where we were suggesting a guy on the Tour de France needs to eat 1 kilogram of carbohydrates a day. I mean, that's literally what they were doing.
Yeah.
And that was, I think, catastrophic for their health.
Yeah.
And I'll bet that, in fact, I did look at what Sky were giving their cyclists in the Tour de France, and it seemed to me it was about 250, 300 grams of carbohydrate a day, which is way less than it was. And for people doing exercising for 6 hours, that's not much carbohydrate in real terms.
Yeah.
So they are eating a low carbohydrate diet, even on the days that they're competing.
Yeah, yeah. So I was going to ask you, what would you suggest that upper limit of carbohydrate intake is? Because if you listen to certain organizations, for example, American College of Sports Medicine, it's you calculate it based upon your body weight, right? My colleague asked me the other day, hey, I want to calculate how many carbohydrates you need to consume relative to your body weight for, I think it was like moderate based or high intensity activity, and it came out to be something like 600 or 700 grams. And it's like, well, that's ridiculous. If I were to eat that, I will go into some type of diabetic coma. I don't think I've ever ingested that amount of carbohydrates. But again, that's those calculations are, it's only somewhere between 3 and I think 10 grams per kilogram of your body weight. So if you calculate it out, I mean, you end up with this enormous amount of carbohydrate for most athletes, and I think we can agree that it just seems too much, right? And you're talking about the insulin and the glucose, and again, you're saying what would you say rather that upper limit would be?
I would think 200 to 300 grams. That's because that's almost your total body stores are about 500 grams anyway. Mm-hmm. And you've got a liver that's pumping out glucose all the time, which is then able to supply some of the carbohydrate to fix up your glycogen stores. Mm-hmm. So I would think that that's about right. We have done some studies, obviously, of people eating high and low carbohydrate diets. And what you find is that people who are eating high carbohydrate diets, they burn carbohydrates the whole day long. Mm-hmm. When they're not exercising, they're still burning carbohydrate. And so a lot, in fact, most of the carbohydrate probably that they are eating, they're using it as a fuel when they're at rest, not during exercise. And the guys eating the high-fat diets continue to burn carbohydrates during exercise, but during the rest of the day, they don't. So they're incredibly economical on their carbohydrates. They burn it when they need it and not when they don't need it.
Yeah. So to me, it makes, and I think you would agree that for endurance athletes, it makes physiological and biological sense for them to be fat adapted.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
If you're going the distance, you have this tiny carbohydrate fuel tank, and then you have this very large fat fuel tank. So it makes more sense to be tapping into that. And like you were saying, if you look at some of the studies by Volek, they were showing, or some of the stuff that you guys have done too, the rates of fat oxidation or peak fat oxidation, 1.5, 1.6 grams, or they did, I know in one study by Volek, they ran for 3 hours at something like 65% VO2 max. I think continuous fat oxidation of about 1.2 grams per minute, something like that. So it comes out, if you calculate it out right, something like over 800 kilocalories that you're getting per hour. And that's I think that's the big deal, right? Is you have this, you have so much then energy that's coming from that, and that should be enough for you to keep on going, and you don't have to rely on this constant exogenous intake of high carbohydrate items. And so maybe, I think it looks like the human body, right, is able to adapt. It can adapt to a high carb diet. It can adapt to a high fat diet. It's just that which one do you choose for performance reasons? And then maybe secondarily, let's not forget from a health perspective as well.
So one of the athletes we were studying recently, he could burn 1.8 grams of fat at 92% VO2 max.
Holy smokes.
Now, and the answer is because he trains at high intensity, and so he's adapted his body to burn fat at high intensities. So does he need anything else? And we showed actually in him when he actually performed slightly better with carbs up to 20 Ks in Ironman races or cycling races. But at 100 Ks, he actually went slower when he took in carbs because he burned less fat. I mean, I'm not saying it's because of that, but he did burn less fat. So it seems to me that we have to, as part of that trial, that was the point I was coming to. My colleague Chris Webster said, so who is metabolically flexible? Because we hear the story, metabolic flexibility.
Yeah.
If you eat carbohydrates, you're metabolically flexible. And in fact, it's the opposite. You're metabolically crippled if you eat carbohydrates.
Yeah.
So in a carbohydrate-adapted athlete, they can't get their their fat oxidation rates above about 0.6 grams per minute.
Yeah.
So they can burn lots of carbohydrate, but they can't burn much fat. But yet you take our fat-adapted athletes and you make them do a VO2 max test, and they're at the peak. When they reach their peak, they're burning a lot of carbohydrate. Yeah. And it's essentially the same as before they were fat-adapted.
Yeah.
So they've got metabolic flexibility. They can burn the carbohydrate when they need to, but they can burn the fat at twice, 2 to 3 times the rates of carbohydrate-adapted athletes.
Yeah.
But, it's really interesting, these paradoxes we see. So when we promote this low-carb diet and we see people losing 130 kilograms of weight, and people say, well, of course, it's impossible because the clinical trials, you only lose 8 kilograms.
Yeah.
So there's some discrepancy. So every day people write to me and say, I lost 40 kilograms or 100 pounds on this diet. But yet, if you looked at the scientific literature, there's no prediction that could possibly happen because the biggest weight losses are 10 or 11 or 12 kilograms on average. And so that's and this is the same. We know people burn so much fat, but yet it's difficult to prove in the laboratory that they perform better, but they must. But it's because it's so difficult to study it in the laboratory because you've got to get people to do it for 3 or 4 or 5 hours. And in the laboratory, it's really difficult to get a maximum performance over 5 hours.
Yeah, and there's only so much time that you have or you're able to get somebody to do a study, right? So we are collaborating on a study right now, looking at the high carb and low carb diets on 5-kilometer running performance, and it's just 6 weeks on one diet, 6 weeks on another diet. But even then, it's still not. It's only 6 weeks, again, in terms of trying to get that person adapted to a low carb diet. You would want it to be probably more something like 6 months.
Yeah.
But exactly. Again, that's the constraints with research. You just don't have that time. But Yeah. And one of the questions I always get from students, again, we talked about this a couple minutes ago too. But again, what are those? Am I able to eat a low carb, high fat diet if I am doing sports like football and lacrosse and soccer, or I'm a track sprinter? Is it still a smart idea to be doing that for those more shortish duration, higher intensity type of sports?
Yeah, I think it's worth trying and experimenting and see what happens, because we know world champion swimmers in South Africa who are eating this diet, and they're competing in events lasting 20 seconds. And the answer is, well, for the ones that I deal with, they say they can train better, they recover more quickly. And because they're doing explosive sport, they actually start with all the glycogen they need. So they don't need to resynthesize glycogen from carbohydrates. They can resynthesize it from their liver glucose production. And it's really interesting that they're eating less and less carbohydrate and going to fasting and all these things. And it's because general health gets better. And the one guy who is a gold medalist, he told me that he couldn't train because in the afternoon he'd swell up, he'd become bloated from eating grains, and then he cut out the grains, and then he could train harder and didn't have the bloating. So all those medical issues, if you have a medical issue related to your diet, you're loading up on carbs, it's much more likely that it's going to worsen your problem.
Yeah, so I think the point is you don't have to eat carbohydrates for your body to eat carbohydrates or make carbohydrates, right? So your liver is pretty good at gluconeogenesis, and you can rely on other substrates, whether it's lactate or glycerol or maybe some amino acids to help with that if you are eating a low carb diet. Would you say that's correct?
Absolutely correct. Yeah.
So maybe that whole idea of fats burning in a carbohydrate flame is not so accurate.
No, I don't think it is. I don't know the complex biology there, but it seems to me that you can do very well without eating carbohydrates. So.
Yes. So when you, again, for athletes, who's listening to this, what would you recommend, if they want to go low carb? Should they be looking at a certain percentage, like a 5-10%, or just some gram relative to their body weight or lean body mass? What would be the recommendation for those athletes?
Yeah, for some reason we've got stuck on just grammage of carbohydrates. I don't know why, but that seems to work very well. It certainly works well in treating conditioned diabetes, for example, that you don't want to take in more than 25 or 30 grams. And that's, once you go beyond that, you start to see the negative consequences. And it doesn't take much more to get the complications. It doesn't seem to be it's weight related. It's just absolute. It's the absolute number that you need. So I would, again, let's say that I would advise people it's between 25 and 200 grams of carbohydrate. That's the range. If you're diabetic or insulin resistant, really insulin resistant, it's 25 grams. If you're cycling 2 hours a day, it's 200 grams a day. And in between that, you asked about American football. I mean, I can't see why they should need any carbohydrates except to make you fat.
Tell that to the ACSM.
Yeah. It's astonishing. I mean, look at the ill health of the linemen.
Yeah.
I don't know. Again, I don't understand the game very well, but it's astonishing that being obese is actually an advantage. It's really surprising for linemen particularly. Yeah. But everyone else is so lean and strong and muscular.
Yeah.
But the linemen are the opposite. My great friend David Pocock, who plays rugby for the Australian team and was their captain and was one of the 2 best players in the last World Cup. He converted and he said it's amazing. He's more muscular than ever and he's got all the energy he needs. He does eat a bit of carbohydrate on the morning of an 80-minute game where he is one of the most explosive players on the field. But he says it hasn't slowed him down at all. And the health benefits are what he really appreciates. And I think that's what we don't understand.
Yeah, and I've seen reports of the New Zealand rugby team. I don't know if they're actually are low carb, or I don't know if you've heard any stories with them.
Yeah, they're lowish carbs, and there's a whole lot of criticism about that. They're lowish carbs.
Okay.
They don't stop eating the sugars and replacing it with coconut oil and fats, but they still do eat carbohydrates. But their trainer is vigorously low carbs, and so and he's a really good triathlete. I think he's just over 9 hours for the Ironman, and he's in his 40s. And he's religiously low carbohydrates, but he hasn't quite convinced all of them. But when you look at them, there's not too much extra fat on the All Blacks.
Yeah.
You don't fat All Blacks, and the muscular ones are really muscular. So you wonder just the extent to which those are eating a more carnivorous diet, the really muscular guys.
Yeah. Well, it seems to be working.
Yeah, indeed it is. It's in the world. That's for sure.
And going from that question, one of my colleagues asked me the other day, again regarding this idea about how much carbohydrates you should eat, and I know you've talked about this before. You can everybody kind of falls along this insulin resistance spectrum, right? You're either highly insulin sensitive, or you're highly insulin resistant, or you're somewhere in between. So is that another way of looking at that in terms of how many grams of carbohydrates I should be ingesting on a daily basis? And are there any markers? Are there some genetic marker, or is it just a biomarker of knowing, okay, I'm a little bit more insulin resistant, I should really be watching my overall carbohydrate intake?
Yeah, I think that the guys who struggle to control their weight, they are much more likely to be insulin resistant. That doesn't mean to say you can't be lean and insulin resistant. You can be, but if you're struggling to control your weight, it's much more likely that you're insulin resistant. Mm-hmm. So that is the case. And what frustrates me is that the vast majority of people in the world are recreational athletes.
Yes.
And a lot of them are overweight.
Yeah.
And they could benefit hugely by cutting the carbs, as I benefited hugely. But they're getting the wrong message. Because the Kenyans run on a 70% carbohydrate diet, then the whole world must eat a 70% carbohydrate. It doesn't work. Now if you're running a 5-hour marathon, you do not need carbohydrates. You can get the whole way just burning fat, and you'll find it easier. Yeah. Interestingly, a lot of people are writing to me now and they're saying that they don't hit the wall when they're on the high-fat diet. They may start a bit slower, but at 35 Ks, they're really moving along, and they're passing all the carb guys guzzling Gatorade.
Yeah.
And that's what I've certainly noticed in myself, that you get stronger the further you go. Whereas in no one will tell you that on carbs, you don't get stronger the further you go. You get slower the further you go.
Yeah. Is there? If you have some biomarkers, can you look at like your glycated hemoglobin, right, your HbA1c, or can you look at your fasting insulin, or again, there's that Kraft 5-hour insulin response, or maybe just a 2-hour insulin response? Would any of those help with that termination of?
Yeah, I think we had a conference the other day, and one of the South African doctors who's been looking at fasting insulins for 20 years, he said once your fasting insulin goes above 6 units, and I'm not sure if the units are the same in the US as they are here, but those units, once it's above 6, so normally we'd like to see it 2 or 4, and when it goes above 6, he says that is predicting future problems. And I think a fasting insulin is a very, very good test. That's the first thing that goes wrong. And you can have a normal fasting glucose and a normal HbA1c, but be on the road to diabetes if your insulin's already elevated. And HbA1c, glycated hemoglobin, is a factor that's the one that we pick it up when people have already been overeating carbs for 10 or 15 years. They'll have a high HbA1c. The beauty is if you reverse the carbs, the HbA1c will start to go back down to normal.
Yeah.
I think my view is that everyone should know what the HbA1c is, and only if it's 5.0 can you continue to eat lots of carbs. Otherwise, you should be restricting. Yeah.
Okay. Also, another there's always these myths about low carb diets, and people bring up concerns about low carb diets. I'm sure you're well familiar with all of those. One of the concerns is, and sometimes I hear this also from students, that if I do eat a low carb diet, and again, as you can eat a ketogenic diet. I don't think it's probably necessary that everybody has to eat a ketogenic diet. There's definitely, you can be more liberal, right, with your or conservative with your carbohydrate intake. But one of the concerns is that if I eat this way, I'm going to end up with some serious nutrient deficiencies. Vitamins and minerals, and I'm not getting in enough fiber. What do you say about that?
Well, I'm glad to say that in my trial, Karen Zinn came out from New Zealand and presented data. And she did a very simple thing. She prescribed a diet for her professor, Grant Schofield, and she showed it was more nutrient dense, and there were more of everything on her diet. And she's published that work this week in the British Medical Journal, the British Journal of Sports Medicine. I'm not sure which it is.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
Yeah, and showing that it's actually more nutrient dense than the other diets. So there never was any evidence for that. Zoe Harcom, who was my other expert witness, did a study of Dr. Michael Greger's book. Dr. Michael Greger is a vegan doctor who's published his own cookbook. Yeah. So she took a couple of his recipes out there, or his weekly meal plan, and she looked at what it contained, and then she showed where the deficiencies were. And it's a dreadful diet because it's deficient in B12 and a couple other things. So there you go. It's the vegetarian, vegan type diet that is nutrient poor.
Yeah.
You will run into trouble. It's not the low carb diet at all.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's interesting because I was at the American College of Sports Medicine regional conference in November, and I'm interested in the nutrition talk, so I go to nutrition talks, and there was like 4 different speakers lasting about, again, 3 or 4 hours, and they talked about every other diet under the sun. Spent a lot of time talking about the vegan and vegetarian diets, and afterwards I'm just shaking my head. I'm like, you talk about every single diet, but you neglect to speak about low carb diets. And and then I asked the one lady that question, and it was just, well, I'm not an expert in low carb diets, so I don't want to talk about it. And but yeah, it was just alarming, the fact that how long some of these people, the experts, were talking about vegan and vegetarian diets for athletes, and they were talking about that documentary, what was it, What the Health? Yeah, and it's saying, they have now their athletes coming to them and they want to be vegetarian. And would you say that that's given the current evidence and the science, that would probably not be a good idea? Or if you are planning on doing it, you better be taking a lot of dietary supplements.
Yeah. What's really interesting is that the dietary organizations globally are predominantly vegan, vegetarian. They're predominantly pushing for plant-based diets. And so certainly in South Africa, the Association of Dietitians of South Africa, the organization that took me to court, is basically a vegetarian front organization. And the British Dietetics Association is exactly the same. And they never question a vegetarian diet as being inadequate. Yeah. So, and there's no evidence, there's no science. There are no scientific studies. There's no randomized controlled trial of a vegetarian diet, but they never say that. Yeah. They'll say there's no evidence for the low carb diet, but there are 70 randomized controlled trials. Yeah. And some of them going for 2 years, and many done by really experienced and competent scientists. But they say, well, that doesn't exist. But then you say, well, where's the data for vegetarian diets? No, we don't need that because we've got these observational studies which show that vegetarians live as long as everyone else. Well, that may be because they do many other things besides eating that diet. Yeah. And the impression is that the diet actually harms health, and they would be even more healthy. Yeah. Well, because they're so interested in their health. As soon as you have someone who's interested in their health, they're going to live longer anyway, without doing any diets. But my view is the vegetarian diet it's deficient in so much that, and I'm not sure that supplementing it, we're going to get all the right supplements. There might be things missing which we're not going to get in the diet.
Yeah. And another kind of going off that, it was interesting. My colleague told me yesterday, she has one of these ACSM certifications, and you have to get the continuing education credits, every now and again to keep up your whatever certification. And she had to watch a webinar that was sponsored by the potato industry, and it was related to sports nutrition from the potato industry. And they apparently from this webinar they were saying how bad low carb diets are, and Jeff Volek's research is not very good, and there's a lot of flaws in it. So I thought that was pretty interesting, the conflicts of interest and all that stuff.
Yeah, it's frightening how organizations just give in. They cave in to industry. Yeah. And American College unfortunately caved in a long time ago, and they're financially dependent on all these organizations, so that they're not going to ever support anything that says you should eat less carbohydrate and less supplements and so on. Yeah. So it's a real problem.
Yeah. Um, I watched a documentary a couple of weeks ago called The Magic Pill, and you were in it.
Yes,
Um,
with the trial, you noticed me giving evidence in the trial.
yes, yes, it was. It was very good. I really enjoyed watching it. I mean, so yeah, I mean, if somebody hasn't watched it, I mean, you can. I think it's on iTunes or there's other places you can go download it. But it was very good. And one of the experts in that documentary, I think he's a physician from the UK. He said, and I quote, he said, "The one question I wish every single doctor on this planet would ask every single one of their patients is, what are you eating?"
Yeah,
I don't think I have ever been asked that question
yeah,
by
you were.
my doctor. I think most people would agree that their doctor is not asking them that question. I mean, what is the importance of asking that question? Why is it not being asked?
Well, the reason it's not being asked is because in medicine we taught the pharmacological model of disease, and that unfortunately is wrong.
Hmm.
And whereas diet is, or nutritional factors are contributing, in my opinion, to 85% of chronic disease.
Hmm.
And if you have insulin resistance, then that's the underlying problem for diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, cancer, dementia, gout, PCOS, and a few other conditions.
Yeah.
So what we do is we treat each of those conditions separately. So there are hypertension experts, and there's hypertension conferences,
Hmm.
and there's a whole industry supporting the hypertension model. But the reality is hypertension is linked to insulin resistance and high carbohydrate diets. And if you don't cut the carbs, you can take all that medication you like. It's probably not going to make much difference in the long term.
Yeah.
I know that one of the trials we did in Canada, and it's published in the Scientific Medical Journal with the group,
Hmm.
where we reversed the metabolic syndrome we reduced it from 60% to 20% in the population in southern Canada. And the blood pressures came down 12 millimeters mercury now without medication. And many of those people stopped taking their medication.
Yeah.
Now, we know that medication, high dose medication, reduces your blood pressure about that range, 10
Yeah.
millimeters of mercury. But you know the benefit, one in 20 benefits.
Yeah.
So you have to treat 20 people for high blood pressure to get one to benefit. Whereas if changing the diet, you can get 100% benefit, more likely,
Yeah.
because you can drop the blood pressure without any of the complications of the drug. So the reason we can never talk about nutrition, and we'll never teach doctors about nutrition, because at the moment you do that, the pharmacological model falls apart. And so we would be teaching students to put people on low carbohydrate diets, and their diabetes would reverse, and their heart disease would improve, and their blood pressure would become normal.
Yes.
And what would happen to the pharmaceutical industry? Unfortunately, it would lose too much money. So I did just to remind you that this week the Verta Health study was published, which is the one evidence showing that they were able to reduce or eliminate insulin therapy in 94% of their patients. And I think they reduced their other medications from 54% down to about 30%. So this was a huge impact. We were removing medications, but for each US citizen who stopped taking insulin, they saved $10,000 a year. That's for every patient.
Yeah.
Savings. You have 1 million patients you reverse on. That's a lot of money that you spend in the medical services. But the point is, whose money is it? Well, it's the pharmaceutical industry losing that money. So it's going to fight tooth and nail to make sure that this message doesn't get out.
Yeah, there was like a 60% reversal, right?
Yeah,
in those who have all subjects had type 2 diabetes, if I remember correctly. So it was very interesting because, again, even in my textbook, in one of the classes that I teach, clinical exercise physiology, I mean, there's a chapter in there about diabetes, and we'll be talking about diabetes again here in that class in a couple of weeks. And one of the questions is diabetes curable? And according to the textbook, diabetes is an incurable progressive disease, and you will go get a heart attack, and you go blind, you get a stroke, and you have a leg amputated. And I mean, it seems to be, I mean, is it only true if you follow the conventional dietary advice?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, it's absolutely correct. So I've had diabetes for at least 7 years, and My conditions actually improved slightly over the 7 years. It hasn't worsened.
Yeah.
But I've been on a low-carb diet, 25 grams of carbs or less, and I don't see any obvious signs for getting worse.
Yeah.
Now, my dad was treated for 10 years for diabetes, but after 10 years he was dead from all the complications that you just described. And that's what happens. Even in the Verta study, the control group who were on standard care, they worsened.
Yeah.
The drug use increased 9%, and most of the biological markers worsened in 1 year. And that's not the first study to show worsening outcomes or worsening parameters with standard treatment.
Yeah.
So people don't die of insulin resistance and diabetes, they die of the treatment. That's the key. Die of the treatment that doesn't understand you've got to keep your carbs below 25 grams a day.
Yeah. So I think we can talk about this topic for another 5 hours, probably more. But I want to talk about, right now there's the Winter Olympics going on, and I saw a report the other day published in the Journal of Frontiers in Physiology, and that concluded that after more than a century of pushing the boundaries of our bodies, a plateau has been reached for both genders. The researchers analyzed athletic performance data going back to the start of the 20th century. After more than 70 years of record-breaking trends, performance started to level off in the 1980s. As they say, simply put, our bodies have peaked. And also, we'll see fewer world records. So, are we starting to hit this upper limit in terms of human exercise performance? What do you think about that?
It's interesting you mentioned that, because that is true in conventional sports. But in all the unconventional sports, like what you see in the Winter Olympics, the downhill skateboard, snowboarding and so on, those performances go through the roof. They continue to improve dramatically. So it is true that there's another component that we're missing, and it turns out that in those sports where your life's at danger, then things do change, and because you have to get into the zone very quickly, and if you can control your mind in the zone, if you can just free flow in the zone, then performance is we haven't reached the limits there of those performances yet. But it's true, and in conventional sports we probably have reached pretty close to the limits.
Yeah, well, you guys have done a lot of research on this. But what do you think limits human performance, right? Do muscles regulate exercise performance, or is it something else, right? Because you have this kind of more traditional model and conventional model of why do people stop, and kind of the more traditional model is basically you can correct me if I'm wrong, is the heart is more slave of the muscle, and so therefore if you're exercising long enough or at higher intensity, and the heart's not able to pump enough blood to the muscle and becomes anaerobic, and lactic acid builds up, and that's it. So
good.
What's
you're describing the traditional Hill model, A.B. Hill. We described that in the 1920s. Obviously, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but you also know that model can't be right because it breaks all the rules of normal physiology. And the normal rules of physiology is that the body is a homeostat. It's homeostatically regulated. And therefore, you can't get out of homeostasis. You can never reach a point where your heart's not pumping enough blood, because that will cause all sorts of secondary problems that will kill you. And the goal of the body is not to kill itself during exercise. So when I realized that in 1996 and then gave that J.B. Wolf lecture, I made the point that the body is homeostatically regulated, so the brain has to be the regulator. And there's not limits. The word limits is wrong. It's a regulator, and then under different circumstances, what is being regulated might be different. For example, if you're climbing Mount Everest, you just cannot allow the oxygen tension of the blood to fall too low, or else you'll become unconscious and die as a result. So that's what becomes the driver. It's the oxygen delivery to the brain becomes the driver. And the heart goes along for the ride, and the heart's never anywhere near its maximum when you're climbing Mount Everest. Yet you are profoundly short of breath and can barely move your legs. It's almost as if you're paralyzed, and that's how the brain works. It sets up all the other symptoms to make sure you don't overdo it. But ultimately, the brain says, no, you can't move your legs. And so you stop. And that's why people die on that mountain, is because they reach a point where their legs stop. And they say, oh, it's because I've got lactic acid. And if I just wait a bit, it'll get better. It's not. The brain is refusing to recruit the muscles.
Yeah.
And the only thing you can do is to go downhill. So that's the one. I'm not sure what limits performance in like a mile run. I don't know what variable it is that is being being pushed to the limits. One of the things is pulmonary edema. You can't allow the blood pressure in the pulmonary circulation to rise too high, or else you'll go into pulmonary edema and you won't be able to breathe and you'll die. And I think that's a variable that, because we can't measure it, we don't know. I suspect that is the one that's really being tested when you're running flat out, because your cardiac output is so high and you're pumping it into the pulmonary circulation. And if you allow a very high volume to flow into even if it's a low pressure system, you could quite easily exceed the pulmonary pressure that is still safe, and then you could go into pulmonary edema and you will die very quickly. So I think that's probably the variable that's regulated there. In other words, you cannot allow your cardiac output to get too high, or else it'll simply kill you.
Yeah, because I was gonna ask you, what do you think causes fatigue? For different. I mean, because you look at fatigue, it's such a complex phenomenon, or maybe it's not a complex phenomenon. The way maybe you look at it. But what causes fatigue during a 100-meter sprint? Well, what causes fatigue during the 800 meters? What causes fatigue during 5K? What causes fatigue during 10K, half marathon, ultra endurance? Right. So you're obviously, so the brain is regulating exercise performance, but you think that the sources of fatigue for those different events, would you say it's different?
Yeah. I mean, I think in the 100 meters, I think the risk is that you rupture your hamstring muscles. And so the system is regulated to make sure that you're just below a critical force at which you rupture your hamstrings. And that's the one. The muscles may in fact develop some sort of fatigue. I don't know. What's really interesting is that in the studies we've done where we've actually quantified the peripheral muscle fatigue, it's a consistent thing. It doesn't matter whether you go for 10 minutes or 10 hours. At the end of it, it's exactly the same. So you can produce the same peripheral fatigue in the muscles in 10 minutes as you can in 10 hours. And I think that's something that's regulated for a reason I don't understand, that the muscles become less responsive and less powerful as you exercise. It doesn't matter what exercise you're doing. And so if you were to study the guys at the end of the 100 meters, you would find that their muscle power was reduced. And they compensated by recruiting more muscle during the race. But that's interesting. So to me, it's a regulated process. That's the actual muscle. You can show the muscle's tired, but it's a regulated process. It's not completely random.
Yeah. And why? Yeah. Go ahead.
So why? And that means that it was evolved for some reason, and I don't know what that reason is.
Yeah. Also, kind of going off that is, you see, if you watch the, say, Summer Olympics and you watch 5,000 meters, 10,000 meters, so it takes if it's 5K, maybe 13, 14 minutes, something like that. And and it normally, when the race finishes, it's amazing because they finish sometimes and there's less than a second that separates the first 3 or 4 runners. In addition, everybody's their final couple of meters or so is faster. I mean, why do people tend to speed up at the end of the race, right? If they're so fatigued physiologically?
That's correct. Yeah. So obviously that's the end spurt, the pacing strategy, and that just shows that the brain is in control. And what it allows you to do is recruit more muscle as you get closer to the finish. And the mechanism for that is, I don't know, it may be that the brain calculates, okay, it's safe to let you go a bit faster now. The other point to make is I think that heat becomes a real issue in 10 kilometers on the track. You really are struggling to regulate your body temperature, and there are not enough studies showing what actually happens to temperature. but I think that the temperature becomes as a real factor regulating performance in those conditions.
Yeah. Okay. And you guys, according to the model, the central government model of fatigue, you am I correct in saying that you see fatigue as almost as another emotion?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, absolutely. It's an emotion that regulates your performance.
Can you explain that a little bit
Yeah.
more, because that's not typically kind of, or kind of how fatigue is seen. Yeah.
So the argument is that fatigue is purely the emotion that the brain uses to make sure that you don't damage yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the issue that we need to understand. So what I tell athletes when I deal with teams, I say, listen, I don't want you to come off and tell me you're tired. That's nonsense. If you die on the field, then you're tired, but don't come off and tell me you're tired. And I think what happens is that, we use a lot of examples from famous races, that there comes a point in the race where the one athlete decides, I'm going to win, but more importantly, the second athlete decides, I'm going to lose, and it's acceptable to lose. Mm. And what happens to that guy is his pain goes up. He feels terrible, and he gets what we call a crisis. And he solves the crisis by saying, okay, I've got so much discomfort. I gave 100%, but I can't go any harder. Yeah. And I did everything I could. And the winner is the opposite. He just carries on, and he doesn't feel any more discomfort. He doesn't go through this action crisis. And when he finishes, he's going to be less tired than the guy who comes second or third. And we all know that when you lose, you're much more tired. Yeah. And you mentioned I used to row, and I mean, the rowing is a classic sport for that. Mm-hmm. If you want to know how close a race is in rowing, you just watch the first team, the first crew. Because if they come over the finish line and they collapse, then you know that race could not have been closer. But if inevitably they come across and there's no problem, they row across and they stand up in the boat and they wave to everyone, the second crew comes over and they collapse onto their oars. And then you know that the first crew was nowhere near their limits. And by exception, probably the second crew was nowhere near their limits. Yeah. It was interesting in the Oxford-Cambridge boat race last year. Oxford came over the line and they collapsed on their oars. And then you knew that this had been an incredibly close race because the winners collapsed. And if the winners collapse, then you know it's a close race. So that's the point. It is an emotion because it can change so quickly. And the winners may go through a bad patch and then they suddenly recover and they're fine at the finish, and they don't have any discomfort, or they don't have this discomfort and pain to the extent that the other athletes have. Yeah. How do we know it's emotion? Because it scales with how far you run and how close you are to the finish line. And we were the first to show that. And I remember quite exciting when I was sitting in the airport and making some calculations, showed this, that your rating of perceived exertion rises as a linear function of the distance, and it just rises closer to the finish. So you can tell, in a sense, how quickly the person's going to run from the first 10 minutes. Yeah. How quick RPE rises, you can project that out to a maximum value, and you say that's when he's going to stop exercising. And RPE is not a function of physical fatigue. It's much more like an emotion. So it's a difficult one, but when you tell athletes that, it's really helpful. They really enjoy it to know that. I have this lovely picture of the great South African runner, the famous runner who won the Olympics in 1996. And he wins by 3 seconds. And the guy who came second runs behind him for 3 kilometers. He runs 30 meters behind for 3 kilometers. And I asked the question, what happened? Why didn't he close it? The gap. And the point is that he comes across the finish line and he's alive. So he could have run faster because he's alive. Yeah. Therefore, the choice to not run faster is you make it. You make that choice.
Yeah. Yeah. And so there's going to be a lot of athletes who's going to be at the Exercise Science Symposium, and they've never heard of this. A lot of them have never heard of this concept or this viewing fatigue from this standpoint. And so, how would you advise them if you're doing? How How can you train according to that model if you're thinking about it in that perspective?
Well, I think all the great coaches, and again, I always tell you the American coaches are just astonishing. But I think all the great coaches know it, and they just know how to judge the athlete, and they force the athlete to believe that he can do it. And I think that's what they do. They work on the mind. Although they pretend they're working on the legs and the rest, they're really working on the mind and teaching the person that they can do it. You know, my favorite is Jim Ryan, who becomes the first guy to break the 4-minute mile as a schoolboy at the age of 17 in Kansas. And his coach called him in 2 years before when he was 15 and said, listen, how fast do you think you can run a mile? And Jim Ryan says, oh, I have no idea, because he's running a sort of 4:20 or a 4:30. So he says maybe a 4:10, and his coach says, no, I think you can break a 4-minute mile. And Jim Ryan says, but your coach, you're crazy. And of course, 2 years later, he does it. But the key to the argument is that his coach was a dreadful coach. He didn't know how to coach him, so he went to the swimming coach and he said, tell me, what repetitions do you do? So I gave him the swimming repetition, and Jim Ryan said his swimming repetitions, which were harder than any runner had ever done at that. So of course he was such a brilliant athlete, he could cope with it, and so he broke the form. But it's so funny because the coach pushed him beyond what normally people would say any human was possible to do, and just did it.
Yeah. Do you think that same strategy is going to have to apply, that same mindset, right? It's going to apply to the 2-hour or the sub 2-hour marathon. You know, they've been trying to do that. It was Nike and Adidas, and it's, you know, is somebody going to be able to do it or not? I was interested to see what you think about that.
Well, you know, the athlete came within 25 seconds, and it's really interesting because before they did it, I woke up one morning and I said, he's going to do 2 hours and 30 seconds. I said, because the jump 3 minutes is just simply too big for a human to conceptualize. And when you think, oh gosh, he got 20 seconds, surely he could have done it. I mean, he just had to sprint the last kilometer and he would have done it. But of course not, because he'd run 41 kilometers by then. But the athlete was asked, he said, the reason I did it because I believed it was possible. Yeah, and he got so close. But again, his belief wasn't quite enough. And the answer is, I think it's going to take another 20 years, because we're going to have to get children who are born to believe they can do it. They're going to see there's a 4:03, a 2:02. Then I can run a 2:01. And that's going to be the norm for a decade. And then for another decade, it's going to be 2 hours and 30 seconds. And then it's going to be 2 hours and 10 seconds. And then it's going to be sub 2 hours. But the mental processes are going to take a long time to get there.
Yeah.
You know, go back to the 4-minute mile. For 10 years, nothing happened after the Second World War. And obviously because there was less athletics and so on and so forth. But there was a 10-year gap. It took 10 years before people could take the final 1 second off that mile record.
Yeah.
And that's where we've got athletes who under perfect conditions can almost do it, but under the reality of marathon running as it is, it's still a little bit too far for them yet.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So, Dr. Noakes, last question, and I'll finish on this. I mean, you've had such a illustrious career. You've done so many things. One of the world leaders in just research you've done, exercise physiology. And this interview will be played at the Grove City College Exercise Science Symposium, so room packed full of our exercise science students. And so, again, I mean, what advice would you give them going forwards in their respective careers?
Yeah, I think what I've learned over the last few years is fight for the truth, obviously, but I don't think everyone has to fight for the truth. In the way that I've had to, because people tried to demonize me and destroy my whole career, and I had to stand up to that. And I understand it was industry and it's a food lobby and so on and so forth. Don't want to go down there, but the reality is, if you're in science, it's only about the truth. And what frustrates me is that the truth is people are not as keen on the truth anymore. And they fight to the data and they cheat and they think it's acceptable. It's not acceptable. You know, science is about absolute truth, and you may not cheat. You may not do anything that is wrong, because in a proper world, it will be found out and it will be exposed. And the only reason you want to be a scientist is because you're searching for the truth. But not everyone wants to be a scientist. But what you can do is help people who are less fortunate than yourself and who haven't had the training. And why do you go to a university? You go to a university, in my opinion, to learn stuff that you can use to help the rest of the world who haven't had the opportunities that you've had. The beauty of the exercise sciences and sports medicine is it's the only profession that's trying to make people healthy. My profession, medicine, is making people sick, and it's not. And the focus is to keep people as patients, not to make them healthy. And because it's an industry, and we as exercise scientists have got to do the opposite. Mm-hmm. We've got to get out there and make people healthy and have them enjoy their lives and educate them. So what I respect about you is that you expose your students to the truth. The truth as taught by the food industry or the pharmaceutical industry, but the truth as it really is.
Yeah.
So all your students are incredibly fortunate that they have been raised by a maverick. A South African maverick, I might add, who's prepared to stand up and say, this is the way it is, and to give them the information that is the truth. And we are a small band of people globally, and we've got a big fight. But if we're going to save people and make them healthy, ours is the only message that is going to work.
Yeah.
So that's my message to your students, that they must question everything and have this goal of making people healthier and enjoy their lives. And if there's one thing I've learned, it is that exercise is critical for health. It's really important. And I'm a vigorous exerciser on almost every day if I can possibly do it. But nutrition is the cornerstone. It's the basis, the foundation. If you don't get the nutrition right, you can do all the exercise you like. It's not going to make the final. It's not going to make you completely healthy. And so that's why I'm so glad to participate on this nutrition component.
Yes.
And that your students are learning that exercise is critical. Nutrition is even more critical.
Yes.
And that many people will be unhealthy even though they're exercising a lot because their nutrition is poor.
Can't outrun a bad diet.
Yeah, exactly the statement.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Noakes, for your time. We really appreciate you coming back and talking to us again. We wish you all of the best going forwards, and I know you have the continuation of your trial, unfortunately, or appeal, and we wish you all the best, and we'll be praying for you and your family that there will be a quick resolve to this, and those who are making the complaints will see for themselves that it's unnecessary, and I think you definitely have support from the public, right? You definitely have support from the public. They have seen the truth, and I think they see that this whole story is just a bunch of nonsense, big spectacle. But we again, thank you for doing this. Really appreciate it. That maybe next year we can fly you to Grove City, and we'll have you at the symposium.
I hope that'll happen.
Just
best wishes for the success of your conference and your symposium.
Thank you. Just let me know your price. We'll bill it to the department chair.
Fantastic. Now my price is zero. Don't worry. I'll do it for free.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Noakes. Appreciate it.
Thanks.